After I came back, I resumed going to Brooklyn Law School, graduated, passed the bar exam in New York, and then had a number of jobs in the area which I didn't particularly like. I did want to leave. I worked for some time in the legal department for Allstate Insurance Company, and again my brother found out that they had a job opening in Albuquerque, told me about it, and that's how I got to Albuquerque. So he always had a very strong mentoring influence on me. I worked for the VA. First as a field attorney, I visited all over New Mexico. At that time, my wife was going to college, and it worked out well for a while, but when I would come home for weekends, because often I'd be away for a week, she would want to go out and do things. I would be tired. It didn't work well, so I decided that that was enough for the traveling. So then I secured a transfer in the VA to an inside position as an adjudicator. I also served on the Veterans Rating Board. I was the legal member, and this meant that we would rate veterans' disabilities to see, well, if they were service-connected or if not service-connected, if it was sufficient disability, and we would rate their injuries. I did this for a few years, and after a while, I found that it wasn't that terribly interesting, and I wasn't getting promoted the way I thought I should. So at that time, I decided that I would go to some other government position. I then took leave, took a trip to Washington, D.C., where I interviewed with several government agencies. Before doing that, I didn't know what agencies to check with. My wife, Rosalia, looked up the World Almanac, found out what government agencies were listed, and then wrote individual letters for me to each of them. It was interesting. I went to the VA, which was a natural place to go. I had the experience and got a very cold reception. I only learned a long time, or several years afterwards, why that was so. My boss here in Albuquerque had told them not to hire me because I was too important and too needed at the job for him. However, I did interview with what was then called the General Accounting Office, now known as the Government Accountability Office. The interview went very well, and I came back to Washington and hoped to get a call back. My first day back, my boss came in and said, "I hope you didn't get a job." I said, "No, I didn't get a job, but I had an interview. I'm hoping to hear from him." He said, "Well, that's great. You didn't get a job." Believe it or not, within 5 minutes, I got a call from Washington, D.C., saying, "Look, we want to offer you a job in the General Counsel's office, and you can think about it and call me back." I said, "I don't want to think about it. I accept." I then had the pleasure of going into his office and telling him that I had accepted this job. It was a high point. We then moved to Maryland, and I was with the GAO, and I worked in the military affairs area because of my experience in the military and with the VA. But after a while, I didn't find it too interesting. I was dealing with regulations, and I wasn't learning very much new. I had gotten some promotions, which was great. I was supervising people, but I didn't want to supervise them. I wanted to do the work myself. So I probably was the first attorney in GAO to be able to transfer from one section of the office to another. The section I transferred to was then called the miscellaneous area, which I liked that title. It was then later called General Government. And after a little while, I developed my specialty in natural resources law. And so I was the person in the General Counsel's office who handled all the natural resources law having to do with national parks, forests, mining, irrigation projects, civil projects of the Corps of Engineers, mostly with the Interior Department. And as such, I was also the most traveled attorney in GAO because I would travel out to various projects out in the West, very much so to California, to Colorado, sometimes to New Mexico and Arizona. I really enjoyed that. And aside from writing legal decisions that would come up in my area, I provide legal counsel to our audit staff who are doing various reports in the natural resources area. And as such, I had very close connections with and visited often with our audit staff, particularly in Denver and in Sacramento. So we had a very good relationship. And I would review their reports for legal sufficiency, but also informally work with them on the planning of the surveys of the jobs, and also would informally correct their jargons and their English and other editorial things. And they accepted from me because they knew that I was trying to help them with the report, and I never told their superiors about it. So it was a good relationship. And I had a good balance between seeing people, visiting places, and also doing my decisions. I enjoyed the research. The writing was something I did, but I liked research. One of the areas that I did a lot of work in was in federal resources. In other words, was the federal government getting a proper return for its resources when it leased its oil and coal lands to private parties? In many events, they did not. As a result of work that I did, I was appointed to a congressionally established committee to investigate federal coal leasing. I was the general counsel of that committee, and I spent about 6 very difficult months away from the office, working with the committee, traveling a great deal, supplying legal counsel to the committee, running a number of the a number of the public forums that we had, interviewing people, etc. It was a report which I felt very proud of. When it came out, the New York Times highlighted it as showing that the government was being ripped off in its dealings, the Interior Department particularly, in its dealings with federal, contractors, with oil and gas companies. Unfortunately, they were very good negotiators. The people who negotiated for the Interior Department were very poor negotiators. And whenever there was a question, it always was resolved in favor of these private companies. I felt very good about that. I came back to the office and I continued to work on various and sundry natural resources problems. At one time, I had an interesting, approximately 3-month assignment. We had a sister agency, the Congressional Research Service, part of the Library of Congress, and they would do research for the Congress, for committee staffs and all that. And we had an exchange, and I went with them for 3 months, and they sent someone over for 3 months to work at my desk. And he turned out to be a fine long-term friend. We learned about them, they learned about us, and as a result, I stayed where I was, and my friend came over to work with us. So that was an interesting period of time. At the Library of Congress, I worked in one of their old historic buildings, and we had many tourists who would come through the building, and very often I had this cubbyhole, this little office I worked in. Tourists would come by for directions. They were lost in the building, and we would guide them around to the various places in the building. That was a kind of tour guide sidelight, aside from working on legal matters for the Library of Congress.